Hello, hello. Hey, this is so great. It was just like exactly 7 o'clock and everyone sat down and got really quiet. So this is perfect. Welcome, I'm super excited. So my name is Scott Murray. I'm assistant, let me try this. How's this? Oh, okay, good. So I'm an assistant professor in design, teach here at USF. I'm co-organizer of the DataViz Speaker Series. That was not my fault. Thank you for catching that. So co-organizer along with Sophie Engel, who is standing over here by the door, and Alark Joshi, both of whom teach in computer science. So we are super excited. This is our first event for the Fall Speaker Series. And of course, we're thrilled that Anita came here to talk tonight. We're also excited to announce the next event in the series, which you see up here. Andy Kirk is going to be traveling all the way from the United Kingdom to come and talk to us. So that's October 23rd, and this is gonna be just 2 doors down. So now that you found your way to the McLaren Conference Center, you will be able to find your way to his talk too. So stay tuned for that. Those of you coming from outside of USF, we'll post that on the meetup. Those of you inside USF, you'll get all the usual emails and stuff. We're excited that you're all here. I'm really personally excited about this event because we have a ton of students here from computer science, from design, rhetoric and language, from a number of different programs and departments. And we also have a ton of working professionals in the field. So those of you that are students, I want to encourage you kind of after the talk, we're going to have time for socializing. Also after the talk, before I forget, there's going to be more food and stuff coming out. So if you didn't get any food, don't worry, there's going to be more. This is totally like stream of consciousness announcements, so we're just going to be jumping around. If you are a student, though, I really want you to take advantage of tonight and these future events because there are people working in this field doing really awesome, amazing work. These are potential future employers, potential inspiration, potential collaborators. So I'd really encourage you to push yourself outside of your comfort zone tonight just a little bit. Go up to talk to some random person. We're all here because we're interested in visualization, graphics, data, and all that stuff. So please just go say hi and introduce yourself. Before we start, not to keep you waiting any longer, I have to give the official thanks. So first of all, I need to thank the Office of the Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. They're the sponsor of this event and gave us all the funding, especially Chris Brooks, our Associate Dean. Lisa Loxton in the Dean's office helped coordinate tons of this, as well as Rosa Maria Gray in computer science. And of course, a lot of you know Shaw Wang, who's one of the meetup organizers for the Bay Area DataViz group, even though he now lives in New York, sort of, but he's just kind of a global citizen. So wherever he is, we say thank you to him. And a bunch of students who are instrumental in getting tonight's event running so well. So first of all, the promotional images and posters that you see were designed by Andy Davies, who's sitting over here in the green shirt. I don't know if you got a close look, but the poster itself is a visualization of what we're doing tonight, so it's pretty sweet. He is also the manager of the On-Campus Graphics Center, which is a student organization that does design projects. Like it's sort of a miniature in-house design firm for the university. They do amazing work. Secondly, on your way in, you probably met 3 really friendly computer science majors who are volunteering to help check you all in. So that was Kayla, Shirley, Z, and I think Tim also joined them at the last minute. So thank you to them for helping us organize things. That really helps. Sophie and Alark, my co-organizers, of course, this couldn't have happened without them. Finally, thank you very much, Anita, for being here. We're so excited. And now you have the floor. Welcome.
I guess since Scott held it, I'm going to try to hold it, but we'll see. All right, so I gave this title to Scott about a month ago, and I chose it because a lot of people ask me to speak on the process that I go through when I create data visualizations, and that's something that I would love to talk about. One of the difficult parts about preparing for this talk was trying to figure out how I could go through that process in 45 minutes. After a lot of experiments, I decided that I couldn't walk you through, as much as I desperately would love to show you every step along the way. It would take us about a week. So I'm going to instead focus in on just a couple parts of my process, and hopefully these will be inspiring to you. And we can talk about the other parts in some other talks. So if you'd like to follow along, the slides, the bit.ly link for the slides is at the bottom. We'll share this with the group afterwards, so don't worry if you don't get it now. So usually I start a talk and I wonder who's in the audience, but we got to send out a survey beforehand, and so now I can just tell you who's in the audience, which is pretty exciting. I just asked a few basic questions of some of the attendees. We had about 80 responses. This is the age distribution. It's just a histogram of the ages of people that are here. Somebody wrote -1, but that's just because the survey is not designed properly. And you can see that we don't have anybody below 15, but we do have somebody between 15 and 20, and then we have a pretty decent distribution after that. I was sort of surprised that there's nobody, like that there's this dip from 35 to 40, but whatever. Then you can also see just female, male. This is me. Thought I'd just show you where I am in this whole distribution. I'm not that whole bar, I'm just contributing to that bar. This is where we live. I was surprised that there are people from so many places far away, although when you see where I live, then maybe it's not as surprising. It's nice to know that other people traveled this far. I hope it's worthwhile. And then I asked you what hobbies you guys have. So we saw a lot of cool things. When I looked at this list, I was like, wow, this is a solid group of people. Like, these are really nice, healthy people, right? And we like to read. There's so much reading. It was something like, it was over a third of the data set. One of the most surprising things to me was that 2 people wrote cat as their hobby. 2 people though, it's not just you. And I just, awesome. Yeah, and I had that same reaction too, that there were a lot of these hobbies I share, but I didn't list them myself. I learned something myself. 2 people are interested in lettering. I didn't even know what that was, but I looked it up, and it's a beautiful shape of letters, which is, I guess, not surprising. And one person wrote making a zine, which I just thought was just awesome enough to call out, just because I think that's just a badass thing to spend your time doing. These are the hobbies that I shared and listed when I answered the survey myself. And I also asked what is the happiest age you've ever been, which is sort of a tough question, but I just was curious what kinds of answers we would get. What do you guys see in this histogram? What does it tell you? To me, just one thing stands out. Okay, so this is asking what age is the happiest that you've ever been. So you can't actually tell right now, you can't tell what right now is in this particular chart. And this is one of the things that if we had lots of time, we would talk a lot more about. What I noticed was that this is kind of like a bell curve, but then there's this dip at 10 to 15, right? It's like the worst time in life. So nobody thinks that, well, there was one person actually, but that one person, other than that person, nobody else thought that it was a nice age to be. I chose 8. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Not a lot though, just a tiny bit. I am a designer and developer of data interfaces, and I'm readjusting how I say that every year. Basically what I do is I'm very interested in what interfaces and what features inside of interfaces allow people to understand data better, take actions on that, and be motivated to do something different. I have worked, I kind of came out of like a science background. I studied biology in college, eventually studied applied math as my major, but I was doing biology research in labs for a long time. And so I started making lots of charts of the data that we would collect, making maps, phylogenetic trees. And then since then, I've been able to work in a very awesome variety of spaces. A lot of the problems are actually surprisingly similar, even though I've dealt with data sets that are as diverse as music, social networks, and healthcare. And I'm currently a data scientist at Practice Fusion, which is a health technology company that makes electronic medical records. I work on the data science team, and my function is much more on the design side of the interfaces we're building than the stuff that I think of as sort of typically data science. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to talk about before I tell you what I am going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about various things that I don't like to talk about, which is awesome for me. I don't like talking about big data. I don't know what that means. But people ask me to talk about it a lot. I'm not going to talk about my love for Phil Collins. I'm not going to talk about things I do like talking about, like flan, mountain biking, climbing, and the previous work that I've done. And I kind of have a love relationship with Venn diagrams, but I'm not going to talk about those either. So what am I going to talk about? Tonight I want to focus on some of those parts of the process that I hope to give you a different perspective on than you've heard before. I'm going to be talking to you about how you can think about data stories. So that's like, where does the inspiration come from for those data stories? And then how do you sort of reason through them to tell a story? I'm going to talk about choosing a user and just the importance of always remembering who you're building something for. I'm going to talk about the creation process. So I'll just walk you through the steps, the laborious, endless steps of creating a data visualization sometimes. And then I'm going to tell you some tests that I tend to use on my work just to sort of gauge whether I'm on the right track. So hopefully those are tests that you'll be able to apply to your own work. So first I want to tell you a little bit about where I find inspiration. It turns out that I find inspiration just wandering around every day. There's a lot of naturally occurring visualizations. I'm going to try to give you an idea of what I mean when I say that. So the first example is the bulk aisle this is in Whole Foods, but it could be in any sort of lovely little supermarket. And when I look at these, I see all these containers, and they're different colors, and they have this quantity of stuff inside of them. And I imagine the people who work in the supermarket filling them up at the end of the night, and then the next day they start getting emptied because people are buying those products. And so when I look at the spice rack at my Whole Foods, it looks like this. And then it looks like a bar chart. It's basically like an inverted bar chart. I see them when I'm walking around. It's particularly appropriate now. We just had some rain. When you walk through a puddle, what happens? You step in the puddle and then you step over it, and then you've got this, like, you leave a little footprint there. And then the next person comes by and steps, leaves another little footprint. And so when a lot of people walk through the puddle, what do you get on the other side? You get this awesome normal distribution. It's a Gaussian, like, on the other side. I just think that is so amazing. You just see these footprints of people having walked through a puddle. It gives you a sense of how long people's paces are. I also am interested in just sort of the objects around me, just what is the evidence that people leave on them when they use these objects. So this is a set of doors. It's the main entry into my office. And this particular door opens towards where I'm standing in this picture. And you have to pull it from that side, and then you push it from the other side. And you'll notice, I don't know if you guys can see it, but hopefully if you look at the slides later, you can see in more detail. On the push side, on the elevator side, the far side in that first picture, there's a wear pattern of very little wear on that door handle. But on this pull side, there's a huge amount of wear. It's like a different colored handle. And that makes me think about how, there's this door. You can, if you come up to it, if you want to pull it open, you have to grab the handle, and you have to unlock it and then pull it from the handle. You can't grab any part of the door otherwise and pull it. From the push side, you can just smear your body all over it. This photo has a bunch of smear marks all over it. You can just sort of shove your body into the door and it opens. So you don't have to hold the handle, and the handle shows that. And then I walk down the hallway. I go to the bathroom. So I didn't actually go in this bathroom. This is the men's bathroom. But I asked one of my colleagues to take this picture for me. And this is the door to exit the men's bathroom. And you see, it just looks like a door, really, a little bit dirty on the bottom. But the dirtiness on the bottom is from these scuff marks that are caused by people kicking the door with their shoes. That's the men's bathroom door. So I just happened to notice this. It was so scuffed up that I was walking past when somebody was coming out, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like super scuffed. I don't think the women's door is that scuffed. And it isn't. Like, there's the women's door. And I just wonder about that. Like, why is that? Like, there's all these sort of human behaviors behind that I'm sure you could use to explain this. But for me, what's really interesting about this is just that there's this visible evidence of some sort of difference in behavior between the two sexes. I see this kind of evidence in lots of different places, including things like football fields. This is a photograph from an article about the Notre Dame football field being sold. You could buy like a little piece of grass from the field. They promised that it wouldn't be the super worn down parts, but the super worn down parts are what's interesting here. Like for me, one of my friends sent me this, and I was wondering, like, why is it more rubbed off on the left side of the field? Like, there's got to be some story there, and I actually just don't know football well enough, or this particular team, or this field to know. But I do find that I think that there's an interesting story behind that. And so this, to me, is like a heat map on a football field. This is like connecting it to the kind of visualizations that I make. And here is, to me, a super cool example of visualization. One of these people is me, by the way. This tans are a visualization of the clothes that we wear, which is just, it's totally awesome when you think about it. Talk about a heat map. And you can look at this in even more different spaces. This is a story that was fairly recent about how people touch the parts of their iPad that they touch when they use different applications. So you see Safari on the left, it's just kind of like all scattered around, just a few touches. And then in Mail, you can very clearly see the keyboard coming out. And you can probably see that the letters, U and H that they don't use very much are not smudged on the screen. That was kind of cool. That particular link shows you a lot more photographs of screens for different applications. It's worth checking out. And this one's a little bit of a stretch, but just bear with me. So there's this fence. Maybe some of you guys know. Did anybody go to Carnegie Mellon? That'd be so awesome. No? Okay. Oh, awesome. Great. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the fence. But I read a story about the fence. This is an art story about the fence. But basically, there's a fence on campus in a pretty wide open, visible spot. And students like to run over and paint the fence. They have all these rules about when you can paint the fence and whatever. But they paint the fence to advertise for certain kinds of events. So here's some students painting the fence. They also use it to do things like propose to each other and very sweet things. But somebody did a project where she actually bored through all the layers of the paint in the fence. And isn't that's insane? And it was like, I don't know how many decades it was that it was painted over and over and over again, but you can see that there's almost no fence in there. It's just paint. And to me, this really looks like a stacked area chart. And I think like if you just sort of rearrange the layers of the paint, you would get this sense of the piling up of stuff. So all of these examples are examples of where you can see the evidence of something or somebody on something else and leaving its mark on that thing. And it may seem kind of trite to suggest like, oh, you just look around you and see visualizations, but to me, it's about trying to recognize the interactions that we have in the world, and then to be able to recognize ways that you can show a visualization that will automatically make sense to people. The reason being that if we're, as humans, used to seeing things like this, like piles of quantities of stuff, if you represent things that way, like a bar chart, our own cognition is, over many, many millions of years, has been selected to be able to pick out these kinds of physical patterns. So if you can identify these sorts of things in your life, then you can find the kinds of questions. You'll be asking better questions about the stories you could tell, and you'll be able to come up with better visualization mappings. And in general, just like the more often that you can connect it to the real world, the more often it will have more meaning to the people that you're making it for. So I encourage you to practice backwards engineering naturally occurring visualizations, because they'll help you ask the right questions, you'll come up with better data stories, and you will tell them in a more intuitive way. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my process. A little or a lot, I guess it depends. So I'm going to just walk you through the different kinds of just the steps in the process. If you guys want to hear in more detail about any portion of it, just interrupt me and ask me. But I'll just tell you in general, because a lot of people do ask me how I go through the process of taking a data set and turning it into a story. So it always starts with choosing your user. So this is my little user guy with a U. He's my super user, or she's my super user. And what's very important when you're defining your audience, it's so surprising to me how often I'll work with people and they'll want to make a visualization and I ask them who it's for and they haven't decided yet. And it's like, well, you can't, I mean, we could just make, 1,000 different kinds of visualizations and then choose one at the end for somebody that we decided then that we wanted to make it for. But in general, it makes a lot more sense to, you have a reason, a problem you're trying to solve, and you have a person that you're trying to solve it for. So to be able to identify that type of person, to be able to understand what their needs are, and then their entire workflow, how you will fit into that, and how you will solve the problem that lurks for them is very, very important. So I always start there. Then I start talking with people about what data is available. So it's not just sort of this spreadsheet or all the various tables of different types of information, but it's also just what types of information do you have? Like, do you have a bunch of numerical data? Do you have time-based data? Do you have geographic data? Are there actually a bunch of relationships in your data set? That sort of thing, because that will definitely guide and limit the kinds of visualizations that will make sense for your data set. Then, and by the way, this particular slide has a bunch of different people talking and gesturing at a whiteboard because that's really what it feels like, and it's awesome. It's very, very fun. But in any step of this, it could be multiple people working together to do this. This is a stage where I very, very much value having a bunch of people to sit around and talk about what kinds of questions would be interesting to answer for this particular data set and for this particular user. So we very often really will stand around a whiteboard and draw a bunch of stuff. Sometimes it's a little bit more, we'll just send each other a bunch of different sketches over and over and over again. But basically, we accumulate a pile of visualization ideas, and then we go and try to see, does the data actually support those stories? So very often I'll go from that whiteboard session with lots and lots of ideas. There's specific questions where I know what I want to ask of the data. And I'll go back to my computer and actually pull up, connect to the data set, and start trying to verify some of those messages. Then I start trying to sketch out how some of those messages can fit together into a story. That very often will be like multiple storylines that you could be telling. Maybe this same point is in 3 of them. But basically you try to piece them together into a coherent story, and usually that is a sequential story. So there's this like long design process in iterating just through all the various ideas and stories you could tell. And then eventually, if things go really well, you get to this one story, you're like, okay, this is the right one. This is the one that I want to tell. And you have some idea of how you want to tell it. Then you're like, oh, I feel really good. I get rid of all these other ideas. I just have the one that I really like. And then you go back to your user, and then you're like, oh, crap. Like, okay, that's not quite right. Like, I have to go back into the trash can and pull out these other ideas that I had and thought that I didn't need anymore. And you piece them together again, you redesign this visualization over and over, and you go back to your user, and this is a very iterative process. You can go back to your user 15, 20 times, in this case only twice, but eventually you're like, okay, I've got the thing. This is the thing. This is what the story I want to tell. This is how it's going to fit together. And then you polish it up. And you're like, yeah, I have the best visualization ever. And then you publish this thing in whatever way that it happens. It may be inside of a product, and you release the product, but maybe like a journalism story, you publish that story. And then you have a whole bunch more users that are getting to see this content. And what that means is that then you get a whole bunch of feedback about where it's solving a problem and where it's not. And actually, it's a really good conversation that keeps on going even after you've released your thing, where then you go back and you're like, oh, actually, this set of users has a different question that I didn't really think of. Can I answer that question? And you go back to your data, and then you plan some more visualizations, and then you talk with more people, and then you plan some more visualizations, and it just goes on and on like that. And that's what my job is like. It's awesome because in it there's so many different types of conversations that are going on, and in the end, you have something that you are constantly improving for a particular user. So hopefully you're making their lives better in some way. Yeah?
Explain a little bit on number 3. Yeah, lots of ideas. Okay. Well, do you mean just what does it mean?
Yeah,
Yeah, so I just mean this is a brainstorming stage. It's like let's just start from scratch and say what are some interesting things that we could say in this data, or given the particular user that we have and the problem we're trying to solve, how can we solve it with this data set? And so it's a little difficult to generalize quite how those conversations go, but very often I will stand in a room with a handful of other people, like maybe as many as 6 or 7, list out all the data that we could possibly show, and then start sketching. You just start sketching ideas. Somebody else comes over, sketches on top of yours. You totally wipe it off. You draw something new. And it's usually like we will write the message in text. We'll say like, show how many active users there were in February. That's a pretty boring one, but that's something we would show. And then we'll draw out how we might want to illustrate that visually. And then we'll have a whole bunch of those, just cover the walls with these things. Does that help? Okay. Yeah.
I think that defining your audience and understanding the data, I mean, the data and your audience are pretty close together. It's not clear to me where you started with a question to accumulate the data and, you know, where the audience came from.
Yeah, it's okay. Okay, that's fair. So there's this process is very different in many different settings. In general, I would say that I've worked in situations where we don't get to just say, oh, we're going to collect a certain set of data. In the case of surveying you guys, I was able to come up with some questions and just ask you things I wanted to ask. But a lot of times, you know, if you're thinking about like how many active users you have on a platform, this is data that you've been collecting every day since the moment that you created your first version of your product. So hopefully when you've created that product in the first place, you've had an idea of who that user was, and that sometimes that user changes over time, but usually I'd find that it doesn't change dramatically unless the product changes dramatically. So you can, in a visualization, if you're starting, your point is just to make an interesting thing out of data, you might be able to choose who your audience is for that visualization, but if in the case of the product, the user could be the user of the product. So you don't necessarily get to choose your user or choose your data, but sometimes you do, and sometimes you can influence that process. You can say like, we're not collecting this kind of data. If we had this geographic data, we could make such a much more compelling story here. And then you can go back and change your product to record that thing, perhaps. Any other questions? Yeah?
Clinging to compelling stories even after the data doesn't really hold up the story, or getting too tied to this narrative that might not hold up under scrutiny?
So do you mean that you made up a story?
Part of the process is brainstorming ideas of what the data might tell you.
Oh, sure.
And diving into the detailed data. So do you end up in a sort of a trap of coming up with ideas that don't pan out, but being unwilling to let go of that concept?
Not usually. It definitely happens that you will come up with a really interesting, what you think in the ideal world, and your understanding of the data is an awesomely compelling story, and then you go to try to verify that story, and it's just not there. In those cases, what I'll try to do is, usually it's not, so sometimes you find it's just false. Then you can't really do much about that. Sometimes that's interesting, right? It's against what you had expected. But sometimes you might find that you just don't have the data to tell that story. So then you'll try to adjust your collection of data so that you can tell that story but later, so it's like a future project. But usually if the data doesn't back up telling that story and you don't have anything else that you can add in to be able to support that story, then that's just something to go on the back burner for me. Anyway, like, because I can't do anything with that. So I don't get too overly stuck to them. In general, though, those kinds of, when stories are that compelling, you find them in other places. So when you find them in one place and it doesn't work out there, you'll find it in the next project or two. So in that sense, they do stick around.
If you look at a lot of what's being said in the industry these days from a tool perspective anyway, you know, there's a lot of criticism of this process. You know, the data scientist goes off, works his magic, comes back to the user, presents something, the user says, oh, no, that's not what I meant, that's not what I wanted, and then you repeat it again. And, you know, as sort of the old model, whereas the new model is more like, well, let's give the users the tools to be able to explore the data themselves so that they can figure out what they can look at their own data storage. And I was wondering, what's your perspective on that schism, and are there certain types of problems that don't lend themselves to self-service exploration of data versus that require a data scientist to come up with some sort of story and then check back with the user?
Okay, so I want to address first this question of just iterating and this idea of maybe lobbing something over the fence at somebody and then they kind of throw back a bunch of feedback, and that it's kind of disjoint process. The closer the loop can be with your user, the better. So if you can be the user or pretend to be the user even in these little tight loops in the process, you can help that process along much better than finishing something and then sending it over and then getting stuff back. I generally want that to be as fluid as possible. So there are things like, if you describe it as a very disjoint process, it doesn't sound so appealing, but there are ways to make it better. The question about just, is it better to create tools to let people tell their own stories? I think that's a great thing to spend time doing. That's a very different task, though. So I'm talking about, maybe I should have clarified this at the beginning, but I'm talking about when you have a data story that you want to tell somebody. So you have to choose that somebody, and you are the person that you've decided is appropriate to tell that story. Sometimes it's because that data is not even available to a user. Like, I can't necessarily share the data that I work on at Practice Fusion with you, so you could tell a story about it. I think it's just a very, very different task when you build tools for people to tell their own stories. As far as that's concerned, I mean, it's actually a very similar process. You go through and you say, who's my user? What kind of stories do they want to tell? And then you're not actually telling them a story, but you need to still understand their stories to be able to create a tool that will let them tell their stories. Did that answer your question? Well, feel free to ask a follow-up if it didn't. Yeah, what's up?
So you've had a unique experience of jumping between a bunch of industries.
Uh-huh.
And as you enter a new company, not knowing anything about healthcare, let's say, I don't know
Yeah.
a lot about healthcare, how much, I guess this may be a question about number 2, do you need to be trained on the industry and the problems in the industry and the challenges versus can you just dive into data and quickly draw conclusions? Are there techniques to analyze the data and quickly draw it if you don't really know the industry that you're looking at, or is there a training process?
It's a little bit of both. So with a lot of data, there's it's like, okay, this is an integer, this is a float, this is a timestamp, this is a geography, like a geographic location, and with those kinds of data, or relationships between people, like this is a mentor and this is a mentee, those kinds of relationships show up no matter what kind of data set you're working on, right? So with those, your familiarity with visualizing data over time on a map would work for any of those different fields, probably. But at the same time, there are all sorts of idiosyncrasies about the individual data sets that you work with, even in the same field. Usually you'll uncover those very quickly, because what you'll find is that when you talk with your users, they'll say something that makes no sense. And then you have to say, okay, well, why doesn't that make sense? Well, it's probably because I don't understand how they're using this data or what this data means. So then you go through this process of just trying to learn it better. So I think there's a lot you can apply from other fields, but then there's always stuff that you have to learn in the particular domain you're in. All right, okay, we'll keep going. So I hope that over that, whether it's controversial or not, I believe that you should iterate and test very, very frequently. So a lot of people talk about the principles that they have for designing visualizations. I'm going to tell you mine, and feel free to differ with them. But I'm telling you them mostly because I want to get to telling you about how I think you can test your own visualizations when you're working on them. So the first principle is to be honest and be direct, which is just basically don't skew the data so that, because you really can, of course, skew the data to tell a story that isn't true. Don't do that. Keep it as simple as possible, so don't embellish unnecessarily.
Don't add a bunch of stuff just because you can say it. If it's not part of the important part of your story, then you don't need to add it to your visualization. Always remember who you're building it for. And then use visualization for a reason. So use it very strategically. So and you'll see some examples of this in just a little bit. There's some examples of visualizations, lots of them unfortunately, where people just use visualization. I mean, I guess their reason is just that it looks cool, which is actually not a horrible reason. But if that's the only reason, you hope that you're in like a marketing space or something where that should be your only, that should be a driving reason. A lot of people use them in other spaces where the visualization is actually not helping people understand anything. This goes back to a little bit the kind of physical metaphors that I was telling you guys about earlier, just that you should try to make it as real and relatable as possible. It'll just be more meaningful to people. You should explore the data set itself early because, like I mentioned before, you can end up in situations where you the things that you thought you were going to say are not actually true. And you should show appropriate context for people to be able to understand what you're saying. So you can't just tell them, like the GDP of a particular country is this much if they don't know what that actually means in that country, that kind of thing. And in general, I try to focus on making things pretty at the end of the process because you can get very, very tied up in things like typography and layout and colors of something way too early, and it can influence the story you're telling just because it's like too hard to fit that on the page so you don't tell it. Well, maybe you should think about the very, very best ways to tell it and then try to minify it later and still be able to tell the story appropriately and iterate. Any questions about process? And principles? Yeah?
Just seems like there's also a level of critical thinking when you do get that data set and how to represent and a challenge representing complexity, right? Because there's quite a critical role of interpretation. For example, you say 10,000 people logged in at this time. So there's a fact, and you can represent that, in a bar, but there's interpretation. What does that really mean? So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's huge. So the question is just about, you can sort of say one message, but there's so much more around that message. So that's a little bit about the context, like are you providing proper context to understand what that means? But then that also relates to something that I'm going to tell you about, which is one of the tests is just to think about the kinds of questions somebody asks when they see your visualization. What are the next things that they ask? And whether that is something that shows a new perspective in that space, like that you've taught them something and you've created this environment for them to be able to ask a new type of question, or whether the question is actually just about being confused, which is generally not a good sign. But that kind of thing happens all the time, and I go through that just doing the analysis myself. Just when I'm exploring the data set, you find a number, and if it's ever, even if it's not surprising, you can end up in a view where you're like, oh, that's sort of like, okay, that number seems right, but like then the female-male breakdown of that number doesn't seem right. Like that's sort of surprising to me, and then you just dig in, and that's that iterative process that you go through when you're investigating and exploring the data set on your own. Yes.
Is part of this being honest, like checking for statistical confidence or like that kind of stuff?
Is your question about do you do it or?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that what you when you say being honest? You want to know it's with confidence, not just visualization.
Yes, very much so. So this is something I'm a huge advocate for. We don't talk about that a lot. That doesn't mean it's not important. It depends on the circumstance, like how important it is to show confidence intervals and that sort of thing. A lot of times the data sets that I'm working on are very large, so then we just kind of throw it out the window. We make this assumption that it's all significant. But definitely, like especially in data sets, visualizations where you let people filter down the data to their own story, you can start telling, there's like 10 data points on the screen, then they'll come up with a story. They really will. But it doesn't mean that the story is actually a real, meaningful thing. And that's actually, I think, one of the dangerous things about visualization. You can end up telling stories people tell themselves stories because they're looking at it, and it looks like there's a pattern in the data. but there isn't. So as a designer, you just have to be very aware of that and the moments when it makes sense to introduce that into the tools you're making. Great. Okay, so now I'm just going to tell you a few tests that I use. These are going to sound kind of silly, but they work for me to test some of the work that I'm doing. It doesn't apply to all visualizations, and I'll talk about that also. So one of these tests is I'm calling the squint test. And basically, when I've created a visualization to the point that it's like somewhat visually polished, and I'm feeling like, okay, I'm maybe ready to publish this, I'll stand really far back from it, or zoom way out from my computer, or squint my eyes so it kind of blurs over, and then I try to see, what do I see? Because if you just see just a whole bunch of things on the screen and everything is the same importance, and you're showing data, but there's no pattern in it that pops out, then maybe you're not using your visualization properly. So I will give you some examples. So if you squint at this one, this is kind of not fair because it's just awful. But but if you squint at this one, what do you see like a clock and then some stuff coming out of it with numbers, companies. And actually this one doesn't even pass like a non-squinting test, right? Because it's just like, what is this? So this is an easy example. Here's another one that looks a little bit better. Sorry for I hope this is not offensive content. It's a good example. So if I squinted this, I'm like, oh, it's the UK. Okay, cool, for now anyway. And I squint and I'm like, okay, I see countries and colors and numbers. And I start basically wondering what the big pink thing is, right? It's just Scotland. It's not like not that there's anything wrong with Scotland, but there's no reason that Scotland is that big and that pink. It's just that they assigned pink to Scotland and they just wanted to color it in. So the thing that jumps out at me, this pink stuff, is not the biggest number on the screen, nor can I even tell, like these colors don't even map to what. Okay, so pardon this. There's 2 cock rings on here and 2 dildos, but you can't tell that unless you read all the little text, right? It shouldn't be like that. Like, well, they should look similar, I think. All right, so here's one that like is already zoomed out for you. The only thing you really need to read is that it says building height. Oops, sorry. And when I squint at this, I see, okay, so I know that this is Manhattan. Maybe you don't recognize it as Manhattan, but you can still tell that there are portions of the city that are really, really bright. And it just makes you wonder, what is that? If you can read building height, then you know that it means that these are just the areas of the sort of the densest, highest buildings. And I just want to just step back and say, of course, like some of the things that I'm suggesting don't apply in all situations. Like I had this on my screen this week, and everybody who walked past my desk at work was like, whoa, what is that? You're doing something amazing. And it's because it's just really, really pretty. And this is basically a piece of art. It's not, they call it a visualization, and it is a visualization of Twitter or something or other, but it doesn't even matter, right? It just looks amazing. You just want to look at it. In this case, like squinting at this, it actually makes it less pretty, but it doesn't, this is not a visualization where, like if I was in the artistic visualization space, I wouldn't be doing any squint tests. I would just be probably seeing how many people stop when they walk past my desk. Okay, so here's another test. It's kind of like squinting. All these tests are ways of taking that sort of human cognition, that sort of pre-attentive skills that we have to see these physical metaphors and find patterns in our real world. And it's a way of sort of handicapping that and trying to see if the visualization still makes sense. The 10-second test, and it doesn't have to be 10 seconds. In your case, it may be 5 seconds or 2 minutes. But you want to choose an amount of time that you actually expect your user will give to you when you're presenting them with this visualization that you've made. And what you want to do is like you either I have this a lot, wipe your brain clean, because I feel like that's what I'm doing all the time in that iterative process of trying to figure out what a user is thinking. I try to pretend I'm them, so I like wipe my brain clean and like put this user hat on. And it's something that I practice a lot. Beyond that, you can also just grab people that have never seen it before, so you don't have to wipe your brain clean. But anyway, so you get these people or yourself, and you sit down in front of your visualization, and you just give yourself just a short amount of time, and you look at it, and you try to see what you see.
your message should come through very clearly. And this is true when you're designing almost anything. You know, you're designing just a layout for a news story. You're going to want the headline to pop out first, right? But there's a lot of, when you're designing all different kinds of projects, you want that first message to pop through. So here's an example. I give you like, I don't know, you can do 10 seconds. But this, to me, this is almost not really a visualization. All I get out of this after looking at it for about, I don't know, 30, 45 seconds is that this is Zimbabwe. Like, Zimbabwe. Just cool, and it looks nice. But it doesn't, I don't understand this at all. And then yet again, like we can go back to that other example, and if you can read the title, there's so few words on this visualization. The whole thing is like this map, and you're like, okay, there's this red stuff south of the park, and there's this red stuff all the way down at the tip. What does that mean? Well, it says building height, and it's an indirect measure of land value. So basically, they're just saying those are the valuable parts of the city. And I get that really, really fast from this particular viz. All right, this is the one that I mentioned earlier, which is what is the next thing that your user is going to ask you? This one's harder to sort of test with you, but I'll try to describe it. Basically, the idea is like try to look at the visualization for the first time again if you can, or get somebody who can. And look at it long enough that you feel like, okay, I got what this is about. And then ask them, what do they want to know next? Or what do they want to do next? And that is part of that conversation that I was talking about before, where you can use these kinds of questions to inform what new things you will build. It will also tell you whether your visualization was effective in the first place. But for me, one thing I didn't mention earlier and probably should have added to the list is that I'm not just thinking about solving a problem for a user, but I'm usually looking for them to take an action. So that action might be to like sign up for something, or it might be to like take a class or whatever. But being able to identify that action and see that that is the thing that your visualization has motivated them to do, that's a sign of success. So this one I don't have an example right now because it does take a little bit of time to get to the point where you feel like, okay, I know what questions I'm going to ask next. But this is a good thing to stop yourself when you're designing something and ask yourself if you have done it well. Okay, so now I think, let's see, okay, we have not a ton of time, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to review the data that I gathered from you guys, and I think if we could start the sort of brainstorming process. So these data sets are available online. Any of you guys can grab this. I've at the end of the presentation, there's a link to the survey results and then a link to all the hobbies. I cleaned them up a little bit so you can visualize them. And I'd really love it if we could just try to think of ideas that we might want to tell with visualization. And of course, then if we had 3 more hours, then we would go through and tell those stories. And if you guys want to do that, let me know. We can have a workshop and we can do that. But it wasn't going to fit into 45 minutes tonight. So here are the questions that I asked in case you didn't, well, just to refresh everybody's memory. I asked, how old are you? What's your gender? What's the zip code where you live? What's the zip code where you work or go to school? What's the happiest age you've ever been? And basically, what are your hobbies? So we have the spreadsheet, and this is the one that all of you guys can access. And so I'm just asking you now, what are the stories that you would like to tell from that particular data set? I'll go back to the survey so you can see it. So if you had the ages of everybody, let's say it's everybody in this room, but it isn't. Everybody in this room, where they live, where they work or go to school, and what age they were happiest and what they like to do. What are the questions that you would like to ask? Yeah.
Well, I'm really intrigued that data lovers love reading. I mean, there's kind of a neat story going on.
Okay, cool. So you've already looked at the data a little bit. You know that the top hobby is reading, and you want to know a little bit more about that. So what would you do to learn more about that? So I will tell you that some people were reading, and then certain kinds of reading, and reading blogs, and reading entertainment magazines, and reading sci-fi, and all sorts of stuff. There's a lot of detail there, so we could dig into that. Yeah, we could ask them sort of more things about like how they read, that sort of thing. Okay.
Curious.
What's that?
Are people who are interested in data visualization also curious?
Just to learn stuff. Okay, cool. Yeah, I like that. Go ahead.
I think I know what the best thing is.
Oh, the best thing. Okay, get ready.
Do people that are happy now or recently have different hobbies
Mm-hmm.
than people who were happy long ago?
Yeah, I like that a lot. Actually, one of the first words that showed up a lot in hobbies that didn't group, like, so there were a lot of hobbies that started with playing, and that was with something or playing something or whatever. This just reminds me of like what I would imagine these might be the ones that were happier when they were kids, or they like want to be more childlike. Who knows? I'm making that up. That is definitely a question that I looked at. So it's okay to share with my coworker, but my coworker and I looked at this data and we had the exact same question. There's no distinct pattern in the way that I found it. Actually, maybe I should show you. This is very dangerous. Okay. I'll try to see if. So, okay, hang on a second. So here's a Tableau demo. All right. So here's along the horizontal axis is the current age of people and that answered the survey, and the vertical axis is their happiest, the age at which they were happiest. So it is totally rad. I mean, look at this like line like this, right? What does that mean? That means like that they are the happiest now. Like that's I thought that was a great story on its own, right? I put in the genders of people just to see if there was a discernible pattern. I don't know if there is one. It's possible. You can see the band from 10 to 15 that is just missing. There's that one. And good for you. So I can do the, so what we did was, and this is not the best way to look at this, but we drew all the, we labeled all the hobbies on the dots that were there. And I looked through the dots of the ones that are along here.
One is the commutes.
Yeah, right.
And the other one is how long it took people to respond to the survey after Scott sent the email.
Oh, cool. Okay, cool. So, okay, this is not the best visualization. None of these are the best visualizations. This is the exploration process. So they just, they have to look enough, like good enough that I can see what's going on, but not a lot better. So I'm going to say that one person answered the survey before Scott sent it out. You can guess who that might be, right? But anyway, Scott sent out the survey right here. There's no distinction between these little lines because so many people answered it immediately. Which is pretty amazing. And then, like, this is sleeping time right here. Nobody answered it there. And then there's some morning people who actually answered their email from the day before. And then I think I'm this person, which is really sad. But that's typical me. Okay, so you said time, and then, the other one was commutes. Yeah. So that's something that's interesting to me in particular because I have such a freaking long commute. I haven't yet done that because you'd be a perfect person to ask. And Tableau is like such a pain in the neck to have two different locations. And okay. Oh, great. Okay, so you can come and help in the workshop that we're gonna run for this stuff. Yeah, I wasn't able to calculate the distance between those two zips before this talk, so we don't have that particular data. But I would love to look into that because there's just great story there.
I was thinking more of a map that shows like dots.
Oh, just the paths that they might take. Yeah, that's cool. Do you know how to do that right now? You want to come do it? I'm just kidding. Great ideas.
See if there's any correlation between the time of day that you answered and your hobbies.
And your hobbies, yeah. Okay, that's awesome. I did, I think I looked at the time of day and age. Because I was like, I don't know, I was thinking like maybe young people check their email really fast or something. I'm not really sure. There might be something there. And then this is so basically this is a timestamp. This is a timeline, and then the dot is how old you are. So I see almost like no pattern at all. But your suggestion about looking at hobbies would be great. I have not cleaned up the hobby data set enough to look at that yet, but I welcome you to grab the data offline and try it. What other ideas do you guys have? Yeah.
I was interested in whether the length of time that people took the answer, like how that looked. People who said they were really happy right now.
Do you mean the length of time it took them to answer the survey since it was sent?
Yeah.
Oh.
Like
yeah.
this procrastinating.
exactly what I was like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, maybe avoiding email means happy now.
Yeah. We'll see what happens. It's gonna be like really awful. Okay. Okay, this person is so annoying. Okay, so so I'm going to the data set. Okay, so I mean, what we're currently looking at is the age difference. So age difference is a calculation of the age that you are now minus the age that you said you were happiest. This particular, like, so that's this axis. I don't see a particular pattern here. But I'm sure this is something that we could dive into more. I like the question very much. Do you guys have other stories you want to tell from this data set? Yeah.
How about the commute versus when you're happiest? Like, were you happy while
Oh my gosh, yeah. That's a good one. Right, so it's like adding on to yours, like, can we show, so this is great, because what happens, this is just a good example of how you stand around a room, you come up with a bunch of ideas, and you see how they start getting related to each other. Like, what I would want to say is start telling a story about commutes, and just commutes in the Bay Area. And then I could say something like, you know, here's a picture, maps are great to get people started, like, here's a picture of all these, like, 100 people's commutes in the Bay Area. You can just see the paths that they actually follow. Then you can start quantifying the distance that they're actually traveling and show some charts of that. And then you can correlate it to something that really has some meaning, like, are they happy? Do they think they're happy? And does that actually correlate to the length of time? Or maybe the mode of transportation that they're taking. Like, I know Muni makes me less happy than Caltrain. Like, that would be something cool that might pop out. You never know. Cool. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Why did you take that set of questions? What was the reason for
Yeah,
that?
okay, so why did we ask those questions? I was trying to choose just a few questions because I didn't want to take a lot of your time, but I also wanted to keep it simple. We would have such, I really wanted it to happen that we would see some similar questions and similar themes coming up. Because you guys are basically asking what makes people happy, like what's correlated with these happy moments. So having that set of questions was just enough of sort of the basic data, like kinds of demographic things that you might want to ask, like slice things by, but with like one or two provocative questions just to give a little bit more, just make the story a little bit more deep, like the potential emotional connection
So
could
it
be
was like
better.
a happiness thing they were kind of trying to circle around and
I was just thinking of like, what's a question that doesn't take a long time to answer that I think is provocative and lets you ask a lot more questions. And asking your gender is not that question, but asking when you thought you were happiest in your life, to me, is one of those questions. I just thought of it when I was at the jump, so I don't really know where it came from. Yeah. All right, cool. I think we're like well out of time now, or should we keep going? I'm happy to answer questions. Okay, we can do a couple more questions or more ideas. I'd love to hear more ideas. Yeah?
I reckon that there are plenty of structured ways of looking into data and finding patterns in the data.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't mentioned any of them.
What do you mean by structure?
Some kind of clustering analysis or sure.
Yeah, I'm not, so it very well could be that for your particular user or for your data set and the kinds of analysis you want to do, that's the right thing to do. For this particular audience, it just sort of clutters the stories that I think I'm trying to tell, I think.
Well, in this situation, you're just kind of fishing for a story. So
Mm-hmm.
at that point, what does the data tell me? Well, I can make up questions and I
Sure.
can see, or I can say, oh, here's a pattern in the data.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm.
Oh, sure. Okay, so instead of saying ideas first, data first, maybe. Is that another way to rephrase your question?
Back to the audience question, this is not about the audience. This is just about finding with some data. What possible questions do you imagine?
Yeah, that's fair. To me, so I think that's a really good way. When I say like you sit down and explore your data early, sure, do a big correlation matrix of a whole bunch of different things. Run a few analyses that you tend to use in your particular field that make sense, and just see what comes out. Because the data will tell you things, sometimes very surprising things that are very, very interesting, and those can play into your story. Ideally, you would start with from both sides, which sounds like makes no sense. But what I mean is it's that iterative process. So like you'll come up with ideas, you go to the data, then when you're looking at the data, you're gonna see a bunch of other stuff. You could start from the data too. I tend to wanna start from what I think is like stories that really motivate people, and those seem to come from people, not computers.
I guess, I've been sort of puzzled by sort of generic class of things that you're making.
Oh, sure.
You're spending days or even weeks putting a graphic together. Many people, and myself, hours and minutes. So I mean, you're doing something where you have a lot of time to think about a message that is what mass produced, and I just.
Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. So I haven't been very clear about when I say visualizations, that could really mean anything. And I have shown you many different kinds of visualizations, so I don't think that's clarified anything. The problem is that when people say visualizations, they really do mean all of those things. And I'm trying to generalize across them. It is difficult to do that. Yeah, I mean, you saw I made some nonsensical chart in a second too. But that's not So, I mean, my job is all around just trying to craft a story that makes sense to a particular user in a particular context. Sometimes that's a very simple thing. Like some of these charts didn't, like getting a histogram of our ages kind of does tell a little bit of a story, and it didn't take me very long to make. But then, especially when you start creating tools for users to tell their own stories, or you want to create sort of a sequential story for somebody that doesn't know anything about the space you're trying to explain, or if you're trying to deal with some sensitive topic, you have to be, you might be able to tell parts of the story and not tell others. Like there's so many subtleties there that make it really difficult. And the process, yeah, it can take 5 seconds, it can take a minute, but sometimes I've definitely worked on things where just the iterative process, the fact that you can multiply by any number of iterations can make something take a very, very long time. But hopefully it's getting better over the whole course of that process. Yeah, Scott wants to do an experiment. Oh. Okay. Okay, only students, 2 questions. Oh, and you have to ask 2 questions. Yeah, sorry. Ambiguity yet again. We would like 2 questions from 2 different students. And no fewer. Are you a student? Yeah. Okay, great. Just making sure. No cheating.
You'll come up to a story and then you'll find the data to find out how to tell the story to other people. But when you come up with a story first, how can you make sure you make it right? It's the right situation. How can you make sure? You just make up a story. How can you make sure it's true and you don't mistake anybody else?
Okay, so is your question is when you're sort of coming up with these stories like we were trying to do just now, how do you know if they're real? Yeah. Or true?
But you can find some aggregate data to prove it.
Oh, okay, because if you just go fishing for data, you're going to find something to tell your story. Yeah. Is that what you mean? Yeah. Well, to me that falls under the principle of being honest and direct. You don't just go fishing for stuff to tell your story. You could just pick the right people from the audience and tell whatever story you wanted. It's not exactly the same thing, but to me it's just the end of the same spectrum. In the cases I've been talking about, you have kind of a set of data, and as long as you're sampling well from the representative people that you want your story to be about, then I think it's okay. But
is there a situation if you see part of the data, you may get one conclusion, but if you see another part, you get another conclusion. What should we choose when you meet this situation? What should we do?
That's an awesome question. Okay, so the question is like, can you use one part of a set of data and tell one story, and one part of a set of data and tell a different story, or maybe together they tell a totally different story? That does happen for sure. And it's actually, I feel, my responsibility when I'm going through a data set to try to think through those things. Like, are there other variables that are affecting this thing? And can I address the role that they play in this story? What happens sometimes is you don't think of those things. Maybe you don't even understand the space well enough, and you've created something, and then that's that situation where you've made that thing you're really happy about, you show it to a bunch of users, and then they tell you, and you're like, oh, crap. Like, they saw the story in it that you didn't see. They know that there's a part of it that you're leaving out. And hopefully that really doesn't happen to you, because you've iterated with enough users that you heard that in the process, if it was gonna happen to you. But that sort of stuff really, really does happen. A lot of very sophisticated data analysts and visualization people will make visualizations that leave out a huge part of the story. We gotta not do that. So you just have to push yourself. I know this, but really, like, you have to try to push yourself to show it to the people who would be able to tell you that, or learn the space well enough and ask enough questions and be critical enough of your own work that you can get to that point on your own. Great question. Okay, that was one student with one question. Should we have one more? Anything? Yeah. Go ahead.
If you have a data, there is some missing data inside, or you just visualization of data set which is composed a lot of the wrong data, and maybe you cause some overfitting or some problems. So how should we deal with this?
So you mean you have reason to think your data is inaccurate?
Yes. So just like the data, you have the name, your age, or something. But if there are a lot of people's age are missing or something.
Yeah, okay, that's great. No, that happens all the time. So, and you saw the person who answered -1, because I didn't design the survey right.
And maybe your cost graph is totally wrong, and even your find patterns inside this data set, you cannot make up the stories based on this
Okay.
reasonable data.
Yeah. Right, so there's a few different questions there. One of them is that you will definitely find errors in your data. Somebody put, instead of a 5-digit zip code, a 6-digit zip code, and it was very clear that the last 5 digits were the real zip code. We also had the person who put in the negative age. There was somebody who definitely had some crazy typos in their hobbies that I couldn't quite even make out what they were. So that sort of stuff happens a lot. There were other people who decided not to answer the question. So that's another thing you're asking about, like just empty data, right? That's actually it's a very common problem, and trying to decide what to do with those empty pieces of data it depends on the situation. I'm working on a project where we're trying to ask basketball players, we ask them a survey of questions like how they're feeling in the morning when they wake up, and how they feel after practice, and how they feel after games. And for whatever reason, we are summing the answers. Their answers are quantifiable answers, and then we're summing the answers to a score. And when they don't answer a question, then we're like, what do we do with that question? It's not a 0, because then that would be like 0 is actually a very extreme answer to the question. So we spend a lot of time debating like the various ways that you could deal with these null values. As you see them actually on in the Tableau worksheet, there's a little null values thing in the bottom right too. So it's calling that out as well. The right answer depends on the situation, and sometimes is really just kind of like you have to make a call at some point. If anything, like what I can try to do is go back to the design of the survey, because a lot of times the survey, or whatever the thing is you're collecting data through, because sometimes you're getting that bad data because you didn't design the thing as well as you could have. So like, if I didn't let you skip that question in the survey, I wouldn't have any empty answers for that particular question, right? If I hadn't had something where, like, if you happen to scroll the mouse wheel over the number that you just typed in and it changes the number, then it wouldn't end up with a -1 in the age where I'd let you enter in the age. So a lot of times what these kinds of errors tell me, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, succinctly, the issue is like, what do you do with the empty data and the null data when you get it? that's a separate issue. What you can do is try to improve the way you're collecting the data, and a lot of times you can clean up a lot of those issues. So, are you a student? Okay, can we just one?
Okay, only because I know Claire, this is the last question.
Okay, that's it, and then we're done.
For someone not in like computer science or a related field, like what programs would you suggest a person like play with, kind of experiment with?
Yeah, cool. Okay, so for somebody who's not in this room, hold on a second. I'm gonna put up my contact info so you guys can get out of this slideshow. And actually, okay, there's actually this is an extra slide, but these are tools that I would definitely recommend familiarizing yourself with. So if you look at the slides later after the talk, you'll be able to see all these things. The thing I made the charts in that you saw is Tableau. A lot of people that I know, and me included, use R for some of the more statistical rigor that we need to apply to data sets. I use Excel. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Well, actually, that's totally not true. But anyway, I don't think there's anything wrong with using it sometimes. And then for when I'm doing designs, I use Illustrator to draw out all my designs. I don't necessarily think that's where you should start, but you should get familiar with some tool where if you have an idea in your head and you want to put it on the screen, you can do it fast. And then programming, and for me, it's about building UIs for the web, so it's a lot of JavaScript stuff. So JavaScript, HTML, CSS, all those things together, then you'll be able to make some awesome stuff. Great, okay. Awesome last question, we're done. Thanks a lot, you guys, for coming.